Efficiency Unlocked is hosted by two tech-savvy physicians and dear friends of mine, Drs. Adam Carew and Dale Gold, who are experts in using technology to automate routine tasks and increase efficiency in everyday and business life. Let's see what they have for us today.
A lot of the big concern about receiving and responding to patient messages is the amount of time that it takes. So could AI and automation help reduce that? And our current findings are saying that on average, when you look across all of our users, we're seeing on average a 30 seconds per message time saving, which is huge. Now, we are finding really interesting things, and we didn't really predict this ahead of time, is we are seeing differences in terms of roles and specialties.
That's Dr. Stephon Proctor. He is a behavioral health clinician and informaticist for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He serves as their Director of Informatics for Behavioral Health and the Clinical Director of EHR Platform. And like many of us in this space, he stumbled into the informatics world.
However, at the same time, if I understand, informatics principles, I understand that, the opportunities and also the limitations of the software. Tell me about what, your workflow is clinically, and I'll try to tell you how we can try to merge the technology with what you're doing. And then that makes that perfect pairing there, right? The specialists aren't experts on the technology necessarily. And so that's really the goal of an informaticist, is to be that liaison, that connection between the clinical workflow and what the technology can offer, and really try to find that happy medium where they're both benefiting in the same way.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of Efficiency Unlocked, the NerdMD's podcast. And you just heard an introduction on our guest today, but we're going to talk a little bit more about them too. But Stephon, we really appreciate you joining us on this episode today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and I think, I always like to tell people how we met the person, and you're like the classic story of where Dale was on, I think, some of these epic meetings, and Dale was pinging me, and he's like, there's this guy from CHOP on there that is asking all these good things, giving all this good feedback. And, like we talked about in the green room before this, you fit that NerdMD mentality. So you're a perfect guest on here. So let's kick this off, since you're getting into your evening hours in your time zone, and we're still in our afternoon. But what we really like to kick off with is learning more about the person, and, we just learned that intro about you, but I think, so I'd love to hear how, just your healthcare journey, where you came from and where you are now, and maybe even where you'd like to be.
Yeah. So I'll start with early on, even before I was on a healthcare journey. What translates to this is I've always been like a tech kind of geek. I was that, kid that in middle school, I was like, I want to build my first computer. And so I would save up, my holiday money and my birthday money, and then, build a computer, go to Computer USA and grab all of the parts and everything like that. And then when I went to college, I was like, well, I'm really into technology. I'm going to get a degree in computer science. So I, was accepted to the University of Michigan, and I started taking a lot of the prerequisite math courses. And my mind was blown about how challenging a degree in computer engineering and math was. I was not prepared for it. And it was really to a higher level than I was expecting. I really thought, I wanted to be around technology, but I didn't want to be kind of, a major in mathematics and going into the high level theory and things like that. So I shopped around other majors, and I thought, maybe I'll go into medicine. So I started to take my prerequisites in, biology and, in orgo. And at that school, it was very competitive. I was like, wow, I'm not sure I want to be a doctor that badly. I want to help people, but maybe not this much. And so I was shopping around, taking some other prerequisites, and I took psychology courses. And I was like, I love this. I really enjoy understanding the mind, the good parts, the problematic parts, how people tick. And from then on, I just loaded up my schedule with as many psychology classes as I could. And I said, this was my calling. I really found it. And that technology bent was sort of in the background. It was just something that maybe I'll do as a hobby. I ended up going to graduate school at the Penn State University, where I got my PhD in clinical psychology. And then from then on, we did our, requisite trainings, your internships and your postdocs and everything like that. My first job out of graduate school was at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So I was hired on as a full-time psychologist, specializing in the diagnoses that I enjoyed, ADHD and anxiety. And early on, I started to notice that the electronic health record that we were using, we're an Epic shop, I just felt like it wasn't really meeting the needs of myself and also our department. It just didn't seem like well designed for us. And so I would talk to our IT department and say, hey, like, is there anything we can do about it? And early on, they're like, oh, we're not really sure. We don't know if it's capable of doing that, or, we don't have the resources to do that. And I was like, okay, well, I really think I can do something with it. And I learned that Epic offers the physician builder training courses. And so after a little bit of negotiation, they finally relented and said, let's try it out. And early on at our hospital, we didn't have, many of them. And so it was still a lot of skepticism about what are these, clinicians doing in the back end of the system, where really the analyst really should be. And after I got my build training, I started to get like the ability to start building real simple things, right? Updating our note templates and things like that. And then later on, as our leadership started within behavioral health, started to have a lot more complex requests, they would send them my way. And I was really curious to see if we can solve a lot of those problems. Early on, we were using a lot of paper records, a lot of paper assessments. So we tried to translate a lot of those into how can we record that same data in the EHR. And that really started to take off. And again, at this whole time, I had no idea that informatics was a field. I was just doing this kind of as a person that, selfishly, I needed this EHR to work better for me. Had no idea that informatics was a field. Over time, as my expertise in the technical end of it grew, and as I started to get a lot more attention within the greater hospital, I started being asked to be a part of like larger hospital governance groups and projects and so on. And then before you know it, it started to cascade where I was helping out with, EHR and informatics build in other departments. And then it just kind of began more of I started to get a reputation for really knowing how to, do complex build. I started to present at, conferences about these things. And then I started to really learn that a lot of what I was doing was informatics, just didn't know that that's what it was. And it wasn't only actually until recently where I've started to actually go back and get a lot more informatics training. So I'm almost done with getting a master's degree in biomedical informatics at UPenn so that I could have that background knowledge about the history, the field, everything that I've been using, including things like I would use things like SNOMED groupers and didn't know where they came from. I would just use them to help us make better clinical decision rules for diagnoses without having to put every iteration of a diagnosis into the system. And so it's been really great to be able to now have that background knowledge, but to also have the technical skill and also the leadership opportunities to really bring all of these together to help with patient care, clinician workflows, and many more.
Yeah, I love that story. And it's, obviously, I think Dale and I were nodding consistently the whole time. Those people that are listening to us audio-wise, you obviously can't see that. But, you painted almost the exact same story, I think, of where Dale and I got started in all this. Again, I always introduce it as like, yeah, I got hired on this team of like clinicians who helped with the EHR, but it was before it was called informatics. And then on the flip side, I'll join meetings now and I'll be like, oh yeah, I'm like, the CMIO and I do this in clinical informatics. And they're like, can you define what informatics is? That's my new favorite. So it's like, it's come full circle. No, super, super fascinating. And you got started in really kind of improving it for yourself, making tools inside Epic that were going to be beneficial to you and your colleagues, right? Those in behavioral health. But then, like you said, I think as time goes on, you just start to snowball and realize, well, what I did here, those same principles can be applied across a whole variety of clinical workflows. And you just have to understand the workflow, and then you can reorganize and engineer the tool to fit. Does that resonate with you?
That totally resonates with me. You can't be a medical specialist in every area, right? And that's why we specialize. However, at the same time, if I understand, informatics principles, I understand that, the opportunities and also the limitations of the software. Tell me about what, your workflow is clinically. And I'll try to tell you how we can try to merge the technology with what you're doing. And then that makes that perfect pairing there, right? The specialists aren't experts on the technology necessarily. And so that's really the goal of an informaticist, is to be that liaison, that connection between the clinical workflow and what the technology can offer, and really try to find that happy medium where they're both benefiting in the same way.
Amazing. That's definitely going to be a soundbite. I'll say that's getting spliced out, perfectly explained. So let's roll into like how you and Dale met. I think it was on some of these Epic meetings. And I guess for folks that don't work in an Epic shop or a part of it, Epic has customer kind of feedback meetings where they'll invite clinicians to give feedback on either a big new module they're coming out with, or just a feature set that's in the more immediate pipeline. And I think that's when you and Dale first met, like around the Epic In-Basket Art project, the ART. So tell us what Epic Art is.
Yeah. So Epic Art is one of Epic's first implementations of AI, or specifically large language models within the EHR. So as we all know, LLMs are very popular right now with ChatGPT, Gemini, and others. And Epic sought early on to see how this could help with a particular issue that many organizations can agree is a burden, which is really the number of patient messages that you get within hospitals. There's lots of data showing that this is one of the, a newer source of burnouts, especially since the pandemic. It's really continued to be an issue. And so one of the proposals from Epic was, could we use LLMs to help draft messages that are replies to these specifically? So for instance, a typical workflow is a patient sends a message to their physician, and usually the physician or someone else in the team, has to write a free text response to that. Well, if you've ever used an LLM before, if you were to offer that same question, it's more than happy to give you a response to that. And so that was really kind of the first foray into seeing, well, could we tee up a response or a draft for the user and then give the user the option to edit it or just to discard it because they don't really think it's that helpful. And so that's one of our first forays into what we were doing. And that's really how I met Dale, is because Epic was offering these office hours for organizations across the country who are interested in this to really share their experiences, present opportunities and challenges, and also meet with the developers, because often developers are there asking for feedback and also giving some guidance on that, on what's kind of, coming down the pike, or how to fix issues with the implementation of it.
I was muted. I had to unmute. So then what's the current state of where you guys at CHOP are using, this for right now? Like, do you guys have this implemented on either a pilot or a more broad rollout?
Yeah, we were, what Epic calls a pioneering organization. So we had started exploring this exactly a year ago from now. And as of 3 weeks ago, we are the first organization to turn it on across the whole enterprise. So a lot of organizations have turned it on in small scale pilots, which is where we were, 6 to 7 months ago. And where we're at now is every user has access to this tool, and they have the option to use it or not.
Awesome. Well, I want to get down into some more of these details of this stuff that Dale and I know. So, Dale, why don't you dip into going under the hood a little more?
Yeah, I think that jumping into this pioneering aspect that, you and I were both in this a long time ago, it feels like, back when prompt engineering was really, the new thing that we were trying. And I think that sparked a lot of Adam and my interest in having certain guests on the podcast to try to figure out how this works in healthcare. And this was the first, as you were assigned and I was assigned, the first time to get our hands on using prompt engineering within the EHR. For those not as familiar as you and I, can you talk about your role in prompt engineering and sort of how that's evolved from those pioneering days on those calls and what you're doing now in that space?
Yeah. And for those who don't know what prompt engineering, when you're communicating with a large language model like ChatGPT, prompt engineering is a way to give instructions to the large language model that tries to guide how it responds to you. So you might give it instructions on try to say this or don't say this or say it in a certain way. With ART and In-Basket, you have the ability that when a patient message comes in, you can also attach, or the system automatically attaches prompt instructions about how you want it to respond. Respond in a respectful way. Try to be brief. Don't say this, and refer them to this if there's a question about a certain medical issue there. And with prompt engineering, I think for many people who start to get into it, they figure out it's more of an art than a science, which is really different than other implementations of things like clinical decision support tools, right? If you're using something like best practice advisories or rules in any EHR, you can be very clear and directive about what you want it to do under what conditions. However, with prompt engineering, you can give it instructions and try to guide the large language model to respond in a certain way. And sometimes it'll do it, sometimes it's not. I give the analogy, I'm a parent of 2 young children, and it's sort of like parenting, right? Like we can give them instructions and we kind of hope for the best, but ultimately sometimes they're going to make, their own choices. And sometimes that aligns with what you communicated, and sometimes it goes completely the other way. And so early on, as we were piloting this, that was one of our major roles is when we were turning on and piloting and validating this feature, we would to try various prompts to try to guide the responses in a way that made us feel a lot more comfortable that the users were going to accept those responses. Also, at the same time, that it didn't cause any, issues in terms of privacy issues, didn't cause any issues in terms of hallucinations and things like that. And once we started to feel comfortable, it was easier for us to start to expand our pilot to other specialties. And so my role within the project was I was the primary prompt engineer and really just trying out a lot of different things to see, did it work? And I'd say, we're at a spot now where we feel comfortable. I think one of the, a lot of organizations reach out to me and they ask like, well, how did you approach prompt engineering, or what should we do about that? I think you want to spend some time, of course, early on getting to prompts that your organization and your users feel comfortable with. And there's a lot of differences there in terms of things like culture and so on. However, you don't want to spend every moment prompt engineering. There's a little bit of a is the diminishing returns. You can keep prompting it, adding a sentence here, taking out words there, and you may see very little difference in that because the model is going to ultimately weight that in its own way. I think another challenge that we're starting to see, and I don't know if you're seeing this yet, Dale, is as the models start to change, you then have to decide, do you do another round of prompt engineering? Because you're engineering for the model that you started with. But if the underlying model, which has a completely different set of weights and instructions, changes, do you have to do that again? And so you really want to think about, are you spending too much time doing something that's going to ultimately change again?
No, that's great. In terms of, obviously there was a lot of challenges as you figure some of that out. I know one of them that I think that you were a leader in is sort of working through this proxy issue being at a children's hospital. Can you give any summary on what that was like and what you ended up figuring out in that space?
Yeah, what a lot of pediatric hospitals are being challenged with is that for those who don't have context for it, within the EHR, you can have caregivers, parents, we usually use the term proxies, who can have access to the patient's chart. And in our case, it's often children, teens, and young adults. Those same patients can have access to their chart as well. Unfortunately, sometimes the parents are given access to the adolescent's account, either on accident or purposely, right? The teen doesn't want anything to do with it. They say, Mom, Dad, you can have my password and have at it. The challenge is then that any of those communications or things that we're releasing to the patient portal, if the caregiver or proxy can see those things that were intended for the eyes of the adolescent only, then you have a privacy issue there. And so when we started to explore whether we were going to use ART or the LLM for the In-Basket, one of the major concerns we had was if a parent sends us a question through the teen's account, is the model going to respond in a way that might violate that adolescent's privacy? It might tell them about a lab result that was sensitive or private. And so early on, what we started to think about was, can we start to throw a lot of examples of real life patient messages and see what would happen? What we found is actually Epic had gotten ahead of it. And so what we had learned is that these models only operate on information that is sent with the message in the prompt. So it doesn't go through the patient's electronic health record, looking for relevant information and then trying to respond based on that. So if we send the patient's name, it's going to have the patient's name. If I send the lab results, it's going to have those. But it only will send to the model information that that person already has access to. So that means that if the parent didn't have access to sensitive results, then the model wouldn't send sensitive results. And once we started to kind of try a lot of these cases where we were concerned about privacy violations, once we felt comfortable with that, it was easier for us to then proceed with smaller scale pilots and then to expand ultimately where we are now at an enterprise implementation.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's helpful for people to understand, how challenging this task is of taking this one question that you receive and designing these prompts. I remember my first prompt that I made was like 3 pages long to try to encompass any situation that might arise. As you can imagine, patients email for all ranges of administrative to medical, to all kinds of situations. So to do all that and then take into the difficulties of who is actually emailing, whether it's the patient or the parent, it's a challenge. We did not go as far as you. We don't have anything live at this point. We've practiced and that's about it. So I'd love to kind of move the conversation to learn from you on, what kind of data do you have? How large did you deploy it? What were your results? What can you share about someone who's been to the point of deploying it and, had some results? What can you share with us?
Yeah, early on, we were very explicit about making sure we were measuring what we were doing. This was very new. We didn't have anything to compare this to. We had a lot of organizational buy-in from our leadership that said, we want to find ways to use AI and automation to, reduce things like clinical burden and so on. So we then wanted to say early on, if we're going to do this, we need to measure the different ways that this could, demonstrate that it was a success in terms of value. And so one of the things that we started to look at was just a basic thing like adoption rates, right? Were people using it or not? If you have a low adoption rate, it probably tells you that it's not a great product or it's not a good fit for those users. And we were seeing early on that the adoption rates were actually pretty good. We were getting rates between 15 and 20% of our pilot users. And then we started to move towards not just adoption, but is it helping with time? A lot of the big concern about receiving and responding to patient messages is the amount of time that it takes. So could AI and automation help reduce that? And our current findings are saying that on average, when you look across all of our users, we're seeing on average a 30 seconds per message time saving, which is huge. Now, we are finding really interesting things. And we didn't really predict this ahead of time, is we are seeing differences in terms of roles and specialties. When it was first marketed, it was really a product that was geared towards physicians, right? Physicians have to respond to all these messages, and we didn't really think about other roles. However, when we started to pilot it, we said, let's try out physicians and also our nurses, because the way that our messaging is set up is that when a patient message comes in, it comes usually into like a nursing or an administrative pool. Those users may respond to it. It may kind of go back and forth a couple of times, or it may end up going to the intended, physician. And so when we started doing this early on, we were finding that the data was showing that our nurses or non-clinical users in those pools were seeing more time savings than actually the clinicians were. So in our more recent data, we're finding that for our RNs, they're seeing on average 40 seconds per message time savings, whereas physicians were only seeing about 4%. So we are finding that physicians are using it and we're getting great feedback about that, but the time savings is very different between the two. We then also started to look at, well, what about all of our specialties, right? Like many hospitals, you have a lot of different areas, primary care and specialty care. And we were finding that primary care really had a much higher adoption rate. Specialty care, it really depended. When we looked more into that, one of the reasons that we found out that certain specialty care departments maybe adopted it less was because they often had a very protocol-driven way of responding to messages, right? Within oncology, we respond to messages with a certain type of style and with certain type of conditions and so on. Whereas with primary care, you can really get a whole range of questions. And LLMs are very good at kind of just general responses, right? That's really what they're trained on. They're very customer servicey. So if your kid needs a new form for, a physical, well, an LLM can handle that. But a very specific diagnostic question that requires, years of patient knowledge about that patient, it can't do so well because it doesn't have that history. And so I think it's really important that in general, when you're thinking about AI implementations, is really looking for what use case is it appropriate for, in which case is it not, because it's not perfect for everything.
No, that's really helpful too. Do you think that, if you were giving someone, any other advice, if a different organization was going live on with your lessons learned, where they would start, or what would you give to that organization?
I'd say start small and really get that buy-in from those early adopters. I think if you kind of shoot too wide, you're going to have a hard time figuring out kind of where this works best. This is such a new technology for everyone that you're going to really need to kind of tread a little bit lightly until you start to build that internal confidence, right? We have confidence because we've been doing it in a while, but I don't expect other organizations to do so. You've got a lot of stakeholders who have questions or concerns about this, right? Legal, compliance, your technology department, everyone, is really unsure about this. And so it's easier when you're starting on a smaller scale to really kind of build that trust that, hey, there's a human always in the loop, because that usually is one of the big concerns is, well, is this just going to respond to messages and people aren't going to see that? That's not the way that this technology works. And I think for the foreseeable future, I would like that a lot of our technologies still keep the human in the loop. And so I think starting small and really building that internal trust. And then, of course, along the way, measuring it. Because as you measure it and demonstrate the value, then it's easier to expand because more people have that as a reference point and then want to be a part of that value and see if they can reap the same benefits.
That's great advice. I'm going to pass it over to you, Adam, if you have any follow-up questions on what they're doing over there with art, or if you want to jump into the future.
No, let's go ahead and jump into maybe the, I'll call it the near future, and then we can even delve into where we think this might be going, into the future. But yeah, knowing, kind of what Epic has shared kind of as their kind of ongoing roadmap in this, what do you think is going to be the next kind of innovative kind of change or evolution of this tool? One thing that struck me, what you mentioned, is like for this specialty pediatric situations where it's just too specific and nuanced and not general enough. Could there be a time where maybe these LLMs will have knowledge of that specialty or of that individual patient, have access to their chart to make more informed outputs? So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. And if you think, what kind of you think about timelines for that too? Yeah,
I think one of the limitations of using a general model like, OpenAI's is that it's a generalist model. It's not trained specifically on medicine or, a certain specialty within medicine. And so that's why it's not, in my opinion, that well suited to it. You will find that other vendors, when you think about the big players that are using AI for ambient scribes or virtual scribes, those models tend to be trained on medical notes and medical data. And I would guess that they probably have a lot more accuracy and applicability because their focus area, their body of knowledge is narrower, thus it can be much better at that. And so it would be really interesting to see if for certain use cases, we continue to use general models, but then for other use cases, we shift to domain-specific models. I think one of the things that's going to be an interesting way to figure this out is a lot of these general models were trained, rightfully or wrongfully on just everything on the internet, right? Just scraping it. However, in healthcare, a lot of our data is behind, privacy restrictions, right? For HIPAA, organizational, proprietary knowledge. And so these models don't really have all of the data that we're using clinically to, make healthcare decisions. So it would be interesting to see if there is a way to kind of have it both ways. Let these models get trained on a lot of the data that we are sitting on and using all the time, so that these models can then be better used for the same specialists who are using those models.
Yeah. Do you think that we're going that direction? Do you think, what sort of a timeline?
I think what's tricky is you still have to make sure that, things like regulators are on board with this, right? Because, every organization has to be mindful of, privacy laws and HIPAA and so on, things like that, as well as their own intellectual property. And so I don't see, in the foreseeable future, them just giving up their data to train these models without a lot of good assurances that, their data is protected and they're not going to be liable if you give it to a vendor and then there's a breach there and so on. However, knowing that, vendors like Microsoft are starting to train their own medical models with the participants who are using them, I think there is some precedent for that. So, maybe it's something where we're 5 years out or more on that. The data is there. We just got to figure out the right way to, give it and use it responsibly.
Yeah. And I think that's great. I totally agree with you on that. And I think what's good about maybe Epic's approach with this is they're very good at creating the framework, for these third-party tools to be integrated. And in this case, yeah, like you said, they're using OpenAI with Microsoft Azure as the framework. But there's no reason why, if something else comes out better next year, 2 years, whatever, that's maybe super specific for, pediatric oncology, theoretically that could be plugged in, right? Because the framework would be there.
A lot of these technologies have, API, endpoints for these things. So I definitely think technically it could happen. You just have to get past some of those challenges. And I, have heard from Epic that they are exploring, having this ability, even with the in-basket messaging, to eventually get to a point where you could pick and choose among models.
Yeah, that's. I think that would be great to get to that spot. And it's a very similar approach they're taking with Ambient, right? They're making those connections, but then allowing the vendors to individually plug in and have the experience be the same, which I think is a good move. It's kind of that app store model almost, make it so it works and then let the innovators, plug in. Now, maybe let's push this even further out into the future, let's talk about, could this technology get to a point where a clinician no longer has an in-basket? That's way out there, right? But that it seems to me that could be a logical step. This would be obviously something like this being a full agent, of the health system, acting as that nurse that's getting the message, acting as the intended clinician, having that extensive expert knowledge. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Is it foreseeable? That's interesting. We see it in other industries where there's a lot less risk, right? When you call, for customer support, think of the last time a human answered the phone, right? It's often some sort of chat bot, and some cases it can get you there. If I, the other day I needed to return something on Amazon, I never dealt with a human, but the bot issued the return and it was fine. I was satisfied. But the risk of that going wrong was pretty low. And if anything, I could fall back to talk to a customer service agent. Healthcare, I think there's still a lot of skepticism and acceptance that's going to have to happen. Could you technically have a healthcare bot? Yeah. But then if you look at the news, you can find, cases where a bot, recommended something that was, contraindicated or really harmful or dangerous. And so I think you could see that. Where I would love, though, is not necessarily to get rid of the in-basket, because I do think there is something that, humans and, clinicians can offer. But I still do think there's a lot of mundane tasks that we're just doing within the health record. Reviewing a patient chart. Some of our patients just have really long, complex medical histories. And the time it takes to go through every note and, put together all these pieces is super time consuming. And so I think on the horizon, that's an opportunity that you're going to start to see. I also would want to kind of move, further than just language and like chat, but to like automated actions, right? That like the AI could automate, the clicks and the searches and the toggles and the scrolling and all of that. And it sort of just takes control and does that for you, right? We use AI in a lot of areas like of machine learning. Well, can it learn from what I'm doing, right? I've been doing this for over 10 years. Every time I see a patient, could it be learning what I click on, where I go, tee up that order, tee up that note? Those things, like, you take it for granted. You're like, oh, well, that's not a big deal. You can do that yourself, but I don't have to. It is pretty like mundane and routine, and the computer could probably reliably do that and learn from every one of us how to do that. As an informaticist, I find that that's something that is a challenge when we roll out new features or change existing features, that every user has their own workflow. They do the same thing in like 10 different ways, and it's very unique and idiosyncratic to them. Sometimes we try to standardize where we can, but sometimes it's specialty or user specific. Well, couldn't we let the AI kind of help that specific user do their specific workflow in a lot more optimized fashion? Learn from what the user is doing and kind of give a nudge, like, did you know that you could, find this thing over there? Oh, I didn't know that. Because right now, what we're left with is reminding users in various ineffective ways to try to do something better. But you know how it is. They don't read that message or that email. They think they have another idea. But if we can give like in the moment nudges or guidance or automations to help their workflows, they can spend less time figuring out where that menu or button is and communicating with the patient and doing other clinical things that the computer is still not accurate enough to do.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to your people here. I think Adam has a few of those ideas as companies he's want to start with. Definitely the nudging one.
Yeah, no secrets given out on the podcast today, but yeah, no, I think that learns from you and knows you. I mean that's like the Jarvis, right? Thing, like the Jarvis wasn't just this like educational, supercomputer. I mean, it actually knew everything about Tony Stark. Like it knew everything about the way he liked to do things, the way he liked to dress, what he liked to drink. And I think that's what you were just describing as a clinician, I look forward to those days, and I hope it comes sooner than later, for the sake of all
Me
of
too.
us, right? Well, sweet. Dale, did we go off to the deep end, or was that okay?
I think that was great.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap this with the Nerd Alert round, and Dale and I are going to tag team at this time. So we're going to hit you with some questions, rapid fire, and you can answer whenever you'd like. How's that sound? All right, first question. I've asked this on the last few that we've recorded, and I like this. Is your mobile phone always with you, or do you put it somewhere when you come into your house?
It's always with me, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's how every single person has answered it. And that's exactly how I answer it too. All right, so I did hear a hint that you're into home automation. What platform are you using now, and why are you using that platform?
I think like most users, if you've started with some home automation product like a smart whatever, and it usually has a hub. So we started with Smart Things by Samsung. It worked really well. And I had, recently we needed a new water heater. So I was like, I'm gonna get a smart water heater. And one of my buddies helped me install it. He said, hey, have you heard about this thing called Home Assistant? It's open source. And I was like, I don't know if I need to deal with open source. Like, I'm going to have to do a lot of work. What if it breaks? I don't have some multi-million-dollar company to support it. And I started to look into it, and I was like, what was convincing to me is that it can bring all of your home automation switches and everything under one app. And I was really intrigued by that because I think like many of us, you have an app for everything. There's my thermostat has one, my hot water heater has one, that light switch has one, but this other light switch has a different one. You could probably have 10 apps. And so I wanted to have them under one roof. And so I started to look into it more, and I eventually was sold. And I said, this is really great. And what's really awesome about that is there's a huge open source community behind that. And so if there is a smart switch that you bought, but you really can't figure out how to integrate it, there's usually someone in there who's put in a couple days worth of time programming it. So then that feeds into it. What's also a benefit is that now that they're all within the same ecosystem, all these things can talk to each other. So for instance, I have a couple of leak sensors, like in case there's like a leak in the basement, but they were from different companies because I bought them over different time periods. Well, now if there's a leak on any one of them, I get a notification in one app to tell me that there's a leak instead of this one over here and that one over there. And so home automation has become like my latest hobby when I'm not like geeking out at work.
I love it. That's like I was going to say that what you were just describing there, that's like the HIE aggregator, right, of home automation, right? It's pulling in all those separate data points and alerts and tools that you have wired in and wireless into your home in a cool way. And obviously I'm a huge fan of open source. I think some of the best products. Look at Wikipedia, that's clear open source, right? GitHub, for all the coders out there, that's clearly more powerful than any commercial product. So now it's super cool. All right, Dale, next question is for you.
Yeah, so obviously you're into generative AI. What's one of the coolest non-healthcare use cases that you've used or different tools used, really outside of this healthcare space?
So I had the coolest one that I did more recently. So I was applying for my board certification in informatics. And, like many of us who have studied for a lot of different things, I would read through the materials and I would read them again and again. And I had this idea because I've heard like college students are starting to use it to like help with studying. I'm like, maybe I should do that too. And so I started to like give it samples of some of my study materials and I'd say, quiz me, come up with, 10 multiple choice questions, and it would throw them at me and I'd answer. And I'm like, this is great. So I'd throw them at me and it would just keep going. And it got to the point where like on the fly, let's say I'm in the waiting room for a doctor's appointment. If I had the study materials and I can send it to it, I was able to like study on the fly. And not only that, if I got something wrong, it could educate me on why I got that wrong. And so my learning rate, I feel like was a lot more increased because I had this back and forth, like very interactive way of studying that before I wouldn't have had unless I took like a course and was able to ask and have like online questions and things like that. So that was one of the use cases that recently I was just like had a light bulb moment of like, this is what this technology is really good for. Of course, I use it for like home automation to help me like write scripts and things like that. I got my wife into it. She's a teacher and she was like, I don't really know if I need this like large language model stuff. But now she needs to come up with like really like engaging assignments. She like logs into my account. She comes into assignments too. And it helps she was like impressed by it.
No, that's awesome. I think that Adam and I both would have loved to have had that back when we were studying for the informatics boards. We did not have tools like that.
No, we didn't. It was painful. Yeah. Oh God, we did one of those in-person ones. Oh, let me tell you, that was. I don't want to offend anyone. It was like teaching us, but it was awful. It was horrid. But we passed, so it's good. Dale, you got the next one?
Sure, I can.
Oh, is it me? Oh yeah, it is me. See, crap. See, I'm not even like sticking to the script. I forgot I alternated here in the middle. All right. So if you weren't like making Epic cooler for CHOP clinicians and nurses and everyone else in the healthcare ecosystem, what do you think you'd be doing in your life?
So I love this question. In another life, I honestly would be a woodworker. Like it's very different, but I would argue there's a lot of similarities there, right? With wood, there's a lot of problem solving, right? You have to figure out the measurements. You got to make sure everything fits together and everything like that. There's a huge construction aspect to it. And what's really great about that is that you get to really see like the efforts, the outcome of that in your daily life. And I find the same thing with informatics. Like when I've, designed something well, because I'm still practicing, I get to see the efforts of it as well and say, oh yeah, this is actually better, or it's not. And I got to go back in and change it. And so after we bought our house, I started to get into woodworking. And so like I've been able to make like, tables and chairs and kind of other things around the house just to help with like functionality. And what's nice about that is, any of us can buy something from like IKEA, but to have something that like fits exactly in that space, especially because you made it, it's just like a whole nother level of satisfaction.
I love that. There's actually a surgeon that Dale and I used to work with that he retired, and when he retired, that's his passion was like expert craftsman woodworking. And the guy, I'm going to commission him for a piece because his stuff is ridiculous. I'll shoot you his Instagram after this so you can take a look. His stuff is phenomenal. He's like he's like the surgeon of woodworking. Super cool. No, great. I love the woodworking piece as well.
All right. Next up, if you could time travel, would you go to the past or future, and why?
In addition to what we've discussed, I'm a huge sci-fi geek. And so honestly, I would go right to the future because a lot of what I read about, of course, is going hundreds of thousands of years into the future. And I am really curious about like what society is going to look like, what technology is going to look like. And are a lot of our, concerns founded, or are the opportunities actually going to be realized? So I would definitely go into the future to just really see what things are like. Do we live on other planets, other galaxies? Like, how do we get there? And all of that stuff. It just would be really exciting.
Love it.
Yeah. So we always like our guests to share. You've already dropped several little efficiency hacks, I would say so far, but do you have an efficiency hack or an app or a solution that you feel like you couldn't live without? And I know it's tough for folks that have a ton of these things to maybe pick one, but do you have something that you'd be willing to share? Or alternatively, what's like a great example of something simple but like kind of novel in your home automation that works well, like through a rule or a script that you've made? Maybe that is a...
Yeah. So here's a common one that, we got working this week. We live in a 3-story row home. We're here in Philadelphia. And so our laundry room is in the basement, but it's tucked away in a section to where when you're on any other floor, you can't hear when the clothes are done. And so we have a script now that when the washer is done, it sends a notification to my phone, my wife's phone, but also to all the speakers that the washing machine is done. Because the number of times that we go to bed and forget that the laundry's done and then forget the next day or the day after because we didn't have another ping that it was wet. And then you get down there and it's sopping wet. It's really gross. You have to rewash that. So now we have a home automation for when the washer or the laundry are done. And it goes to either of our phones so that we can both be aware. And when I got it to happen on all of our speakers, my wife was like, now that's cool. Because a lot of my automations, I don't go very unappreciated by everyone else, but that hit, and I was like, yes,
that's
success.
Awesome. Does it sing some sort of song on the speakers, or what does it say?
So it says, yippee, the laundry's done. And I just discovered last night that I can change the voices. So I'm going to start playing around with different voices to see, because a lot of people try to get like the Jarvis voice, which you can actually get into it. So I just needed to make sure it worked on a basic level. But now that I know, it's nice.
Very cool. Love that. And then the last question we always like to ask is, and I originally used to ask this as just a book, but like, do you have a book or a podcast or a YouTube channel that you like kind of consume from and that you would like to share that you think is worthwhile?
Yeah. And actually, just let me make sure I get the name right on it. Because as I started to get more interested in AI, I was looking for, engaging ways to find out about the technology without it being way too technical. So there's 2 podcasts that I would highly recommend. Hard Fork by the New York Times, which is really good because they're going over technology in general. And another one that I really like, which is a lot shorter, which allows me to kind of get updates in between like small chunks of time, is the AI Breakdown, which the host has a 5 to 10 minute daily brief of some of the highlights. And then if I'm interested in something, then I can find out more. So those are the 2 podcasts that I would recommend to users who are kind of looking for a larger, what's going on in tech with a little bit of AI, and then the second one is looking more specifically at AI.
Great 2 recommendations. I'm going to add those to my follow list once we get off of this recording. Well, sweet. I mean, Stephon, we really appreciate you taking time to join us. I'm speaking for me and Dale, but I think do you have any final kind of words that you want to close with?
No, I would say for all of those, early, clinicians who are kind of interested in technology, definitely continue to look into what informatics is. There's a huge, opportunity there. And like the 3 of us have been saying, I don't think many of us even knew it was a thing. I think it's only going to get bigger because technology is a lot more integrated into our personal as well as our professional lives. So I think there's a lot of room to find opportunities, especially with AI and what other technologies happen to come afterwards. So definitely look into, opportunities to learn formally or informally about it and see really if you can find a way to kind of help it, with, helping, on a personal level, helping with patients and your colleagues in your organizations.
Great advice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, super great advice. Thank you for joining us, taking time, and hopefully we'll run into you casually at UGM or a future event where we're in person. So take care, Stephon.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to Efficiency Unlocked, Nerd Tested, MD Approved, a Nerd MD's podcast by Drs. Adam Carew and Dale Gold.